There is something terrifying about silence because sometimes silence is not empty at all. Sometimes it is a person sitting alone at night, haunted by a realization they can no longer escape, a realization that arrives too late. Imagine this for a moment. Someone once had your presence, your trust, your energy, your understanding, and they treated it as if it would always remain. But now, the absence of what they lost has become louder than any words they ever ignored. And somewhere deep inside their mind, something has started changing. Because the human soul has a dangerous habit, it does not fully recognize value until loss forces awareness into consciousness. People can lie to others. They can lie to themselves. They can bury emotions under pride, distractions, and temporary pleasures. But the unconscious mind remembers everything that carried emotional meaning. Every genuine connection. Every wound. Every moment they should have valued more carefully. And when a person finally realizes they destroyed something real, the mind begins turning against its own illusions. Sleep changes, thoughts change, emotions change, even silence changes. Because deep down, they already know. They made a mistake. Silence is one of the strangest forms of confession. Most people believe regret always arrives with words, explanations, or dramatic apologies, but the deepest realizations rarely appear that way. Human beings often reveal the truth of their emotions indirectly, especially when guilt begins rising from the unconscious mind. A person who knows they made a mistake may never openly admit it at first, yet their silence slowly begins exposing everything they are trying to hide. This is because the human psyche struggles to remain at peace after harming something meaningful. Even when the conscious mind attempts to justify the past, the deeper layers of the personality continue carrying the emotional weight of what happened. At first, silence can appear cold. It may seem like indifference, avoidance, or emotional distance. But there are moments when silence becomes something entirely different. It becomes heavy. A person starts thinking more than speaking. They replay conversations privately. They remember details they once ignored. The absence of the other person begins creating psychological pressure within them. This pressure is difficult to escape because meaningful emotional connection. Emotions do not disappear simply because someone walks away from them. The unconscious remembers emotional truth long after the ego pretends to move on. Many people are uncomfortable facing the reality that they caused pain. The ego naturally protects itself from shame because shame threatens the image people have created about who they are. Someone may want to believe they were right, justified, or emotionally unaffected. Yet silence slowly exposes the conflict happening inside them. Their behavior changes. Their energy changes. Sometimes they become unusually reflective. Sometimes they begin observing from a distance instead of speaking directly. Sometimes they withdraw from distractions because the inner world has become louder than external noise. This is how regret often begins, not with confession, but with emotional disturbance. There is also a reason why silence becomes stronger after loss. When a meaningful person is no longer emotionally available, the mind loses its distractions and begins confronting absence itself. Absence has a psychological force that reveals hidden emotions. What was once taken for granted suddenly becomes emotionally valuable. Small memories gain a significant importance. The mind returns to unfinished moments because unresolved emotional experiences seek completion. A person who once ignored your presence may suddenly feel surrounded by reminders of you. Not because life is punishing them, but because the unconscious mind connects meaning to emotional memory. This is why some people begin changing long before they ever speak honestly. Their silence starts carrying emotional tension. They may hesitate before contacting you. They may repeatedly appear and disappear. They may struggle to explain themselves clearly because part of them is fighting between pride and emotional truth. The deeper the connection was, the harder it becomes for them to escape the realization of what they lost. Silence then becomes more revealing than language itself. Words can be manipulated. People can lie through speech. They can perform confidence while hiding emotional chaos underneath. But silence often exposes what language tries to control. A person haunted by regret cannot fully silence the unconscious mind forever. Eventually, the emotional truth begins surfacing through behavior, attention, memories, and emotional reactions they themselves may not understand. What they refuse to say directly starts expressing itself indirectly. Because the human soul has a natural tendency to move toward truth, even when the ego resists it. The unconscious mind is far more powerful than most people realize. A person may convince themselves that they have moved on, forgotten someone, or escaped the emotional consequences of their actions, yet deep beneath conscious awareness, the psyche continues holding everything that carried emotional meaning. The unconscious does not function like ordinary memory. It does not simply store information as facts. It stores emotional experiences as living psychological energy. This is why certain people remain unforgettable long after communication ends, and why unresolved emotions continue resurfacing in thoughts, dreams, behaviors, and emotional reactions that seem impossible to control. Many individuals believe forgetting is a decision. They assume that if they distract themselves enough, stay busy enough, or avoid emotional reflection long enough, the past will disappear naturally. But the unconscious mind does not operate according to denial. What is emotionally significant becomes embedded with. They thin the deeper layers of the personality. The more meaningful the connection was, the more powerful its imprint becomes. Even if the conscious mind stops thinking about someone temporarily, the unconscious continues carrying their emotional presence silently in the background. This is why people often become unexpectedly emotional at strange moments. A song, a place, a familiar voice, or even a random silence can suddenly awaken memories that seemed buried. The conscious mind becomes confused because it believes the situation was already finished, but emotionally, the psyche never fully released it. The unconscious constantly seeks wholeness and emotional resolution. Anything unfinished continues existing internally as tension. That tension eventually demands attention. When someone makes a mistake in a meaningful relationship, they are showing that they care about the other person and are willing to work through the issue together. The unconscious stores not only the memory of the person, but also the emotional truth connected to the loss. The conscious ego may create excuses to avoid guilt. It may blame circumstances, timing, or misunderstandings. Yet the unconscious knows when something valuable was damaged. This creates an inner conflict between the image a person wants to believe about themselves and the deeper truth they cannot completely escape. Over time, this conflict begins affecting behavior, emotions, and even identity itself. People often think regret appears immediately, but deep psychological regret usually develops slowly. At first, pride protects the ego from pain. A person distracts themselves, seeks external validation, or convinces themselves they made the correct choice. But once silence and absence create enough emotional space, the unconscious begins speaking louder. The mind starts revisiting memories repeatedly. Certain moments gain emotional intensity. The person begins recognizing details they once ignored. What seemed unimportant before suddenly carries emotional weight because the unconscious is revealing the hidden value of the connection. Dreams also become important during this process. The unconscious frequently communicates through symbols, emotions, and recurring images. A person may begin dreaming about someone they claim not to care about anymore. This happens because dreams bypass the ego and reveal emotional truths buried beneath conscious control. The unconscious does not care about pride, appearances, or emotional performance. It reveals what still lives inside the psyche. There is also a psychological reason why some people cannot fully replace one specific person, even after meeting many others. The unconscious forms emotional associations based on depth, not convenience. Genuine emotional bonds affect the structure of the inner world itself. Certain connections awaken parts of the personality that remain untouched by ordinary relationships. Once this happens, the psyche remembers the experience with unusual intensity. The unconscious never forgets emotional truth because meaningful experiences become part of personal transformation. Even when people try escaping their feelings, those feelings continue shaping their reactions, decisions, fears, and desires from beneath awareness. What remains unresolved internally continues influencing life quietly, patiently, and persistently through the hidden language of the soul. Human beings rarely recognize the true value of something while it is constantly available to them. The mind easily becomes familiar with presence, attention, affection, and emotional support. What is familiar often becomes psychologically invisible. People assume certain conditions. Connections will always remain accessible, so they stop seeing their depth clearly. This is one of the great tragedies of human nature. Many individuals only awaken to the importance of a person after absence removes the emotional comfort they once took for granted. Loss becomes the force that reveals meaning. When someone walks away or emotionally disappears, the mind enters a different psychological state. The routines that once distracted a person begin collapsing. Conversations that seemed ordinary suddenly become memories filled with emotional weight. The silence left behind creates space for reflection, and reflection often exposes truths the ego ignored before. This is why loss has the power to create awareness. It interrupts illusion. It forces the psyche to confront reality without distraction. At first, many people resist this realization. The ego does not want to admit that it failed to appreciate something meaningful. Pride tries protecting the individual from emotional pain by minimizing the loss. A person may tell themselves they are fine, that the connection was not special, or that they can easily replace what disappeared. But emotional truth cannot remain buried forever. Once absence becomes emotionally real, the unconscious begins revealing what the conscious mind refused to understand. This process happens slowly. A person may suddenly notice how empty certain experiences feel without the other individual present. Familiar routines lose emotional warmth. New conversations feel superficial. Even achievements begin feeling strangely incomplete because the emotional connection that once gave life meaning is no longer there. This realization becomes especially powerful when someone recognizes that the person they lost offered emotional understanding, safety, or authenticity that is difficult to find elsewhere. Loss also changes perception. Small moments that once seemed insignificant become emotionally valuable in memory. A simple conversation, a look, a shared silence, or a moment of emotional support begins replaying repeatedly in the mind. The unconscious starts gathering emotional evidence that the connection mattered far more than the ego admitted. What was once ignored becomes unforgettable. This is why some people become haunted by memories long after separation. The psyche is attempting to process the emotional truth of what was lost. There is also a deeper psychological reason why absence creates awareness. Human beings often define value through emotional contrast. People understand warmth more deeply after experiencing coldness. They understand connection more deeply after loneliness. In the same way, loss reveals emotional importance because the mind finally experiences life without the presence that once balanced it internally. The emotional gap becomes impossible to ignore. Sometimes this realization changes a person completely. Someone who once acted carelessly begins becoming more reflective. They start questioning their decisions, behavior, and emotional immaturity. The pain of losing something meaningful forces psychological growth because suffering has a unique ability to awaken self-awareness. A person may begin recognizing patterns within themselves they never noticed before: fear of vulnerability, emotional avoidance, pride, or the inability to appreciate genuine connection while it existed. The painful truth is that awareness often arrives too late. By the time someone fully understands the value of what they lost, the connection may already be damaged beyond repair. Yet even then, the realization continues transforming them internally. Loss becomes a psychological mirror that exposes hidden parts of the personality. It reveals emotional blindness, suppressed feelings, and unresolved fears. The absence of one meaningful person can completely alter the way someone understands love, relationships, and themselves because the human soul learns certain truths only through emptiness. When a person realizes they made a mistake, the change rarely begins through words. It begins internally, deep within the emotional structure of the psyche. Before someone admits regret openly, their behavior often starts shifting in subtle and unconscious ways. This happens because inner conflict creates psychological tension, and the human mind struggles to remain emotionally stable when two opposing truths exist at the same time. On one side, the ego wants to protect pride, maintain control, and avoid shame. On the other side, the deeper self recognizes that something meaningful was damaged or lost. This silent battle changes behavior long before confession ever arrives. A person experiencing inner conflict often becomes emotionally inconsistent. They may pull away, then suddenly return with much attention or curiosity. They may act distant while secretly observing you. At times they appear emotionally cold, but underneath that surface, the unconscious mind is becoming increasingly restless. This confusion is not random. It reflects the struggle between emotional truth and emotional defense. The conscious mind wants certainty, but the unconscious keeps forcing unresolved feelings back into awareness. This is why people who regret their actions often behave differently without fully understanding why. Their emotional reactions become stronger. Small reminders trigger unexpected feelings. They begin thinking about conversations, memories, or moments they once ignored. Even their body language can change. A person who once seemed emotionally unaffected may suddenly hesitate, become quieter, more reflective, or emotionally sensitive around the topic they are trying to avoid. The psyche reveals conflict indirectly because emotional truth cannot remain suppressed forever. There is also a psychological reason why inner conflict becomes exhausting over time. Maintaining emotional denial requires constant energy. A person must repeatedly convince themselves that they do not care, that the loss was necessary, or that their actions were justified. But the unconscious mind does not stop communicating simply because the ego wants silence. The deeper self continues sending emotional signals through anxiety, regret, dreams, intrusive thoughts, and emotional discomfort. Eventually, the individual becomes tired of fighting themselves internally. This internal tension often changes the way a person sees the world. They begin noticing emotional emptiness where they once felt certainty. Other relationships may start feeling shallow or emotionally disconnected because unresolved guilt changes perception. Someone who once avoided emotional depth may suddenly crave understanding, honesty, or emotional closeness. This transformation happens because painful self-awareness forces the personality to confront hidden weaknesses. Inner conflict also affects identity. A person begins questioning the image they had of themselves. They may have believed they were strong, rational, or emotionally detached, but realizing they hurt someone meaningful creates a fracture within that self-image. The mind struggles to reconcile the difference between who they thought they were and who their actions revealed. This creates emotional instability because the psyche naturally seeks psychological balance. Over time, these inner contradictions begin influencing choices and behavior more strongly. A person may become softer, more emotionally open, or more careful with others. In some cases, they attempt reconnection because the emotional pressure becomes impossible to ignore. In other cases, they remain silent but internally transformed by the awareness of what they lost. The deeper the emotional connection was, the more powerful the internal conflict becomes. Because meaningful relationships affect not only emotions, but the structure of the personality itself. Human beings often believe that connections exist only through physical presence, conversation, or visible interaction. But emotional bonds operate on a much deeper psychological level. When two people share a meaningful emotional connection, something lasting is created within the unconscious mind. Even after distance, silence, or separation, the emotional imprint of that person continues living internally. This is why some individuals remain emotionally present long after they are physically gone. The energy between two people does not simply disappear because communication ends. The psyche continues carrying the emotional impact of the connection in ways most people do not fully understand. Every deep interaction leaves psychological traces. A meaningful person becomes associated with emotions, memories, emotional safety, vulnerability, and identity itself. Over time, these experiences form emotional patterns within the unconscious mind. Certain voices, gestures, conversations, and emotional experiences become linked together internally. This creates a bond that continues influencing thoughts and emotions even in absence. The conscious mind may attempt to move forward logically, but the unconscious continues reacting emotionally to the connection because it has already become part of the person's inner world. This is why some people suddenly think about someone without explanation. A memory appears unexpectedly. A feeling emerges without warning. Certain places, songs, or moments trigger emotions that feel strangely alive despite the passage of time. These experiences are not always coincidence. The unconscious mind constantly associates emotional meaning with symbols, sensation, and memories connected to people who affected the soul deeply. Emotional energy survives because meaningful connections reshape the internal landscape of the psyche. There is also a reason why emotional bonds feel stronger after separation. Absence removes physical interaction, but it often intensifies psychological awareness. Without distractions, the mind begins focusing more deeply on emotional memory. A person may realize how much emotional influence someone had only after their presence disappears. This creates a strange emotional tension, where the connection feels invisible yet still deeply active internally. The unconscious keeps returning to what carried emotional significance because unresolved emotional energy naturally seeks expression. Sometimes this emotional imprint becomes visible through behavior. A person may unconsciously compare others to the one they lost. They may search for familiar emotional qualities in new relationships, but fail to find the same depth. This happens because genuine emotional connections are unique. Not every relationship reaches the same psychological depth or activates the same parts of the personality. Certain people awaken emotional experiences that permanently alter the way someone feels, thinks, and relates to others. The body itself can also carry emotional memory. Human emotions are not purely intellectual experiences. Emotional pain, longing, regret, and attachment often affect physical sensations, sleep, energy levels, and emotional stability. A person may feel restless, emotionally heavy, or internally unsettled without fully understanding why. The unconscious communicates through both mind and body because emotional experiences become embedded within the nervous system itself. What makes these emotional bonds so powerful is that they often operate beyond conscious control. A person may sincerely try forgetting someone, yet emotional reminders continue appearing unexpectedly. This creates frustration because the ego wants emotional independence while the unconscious continues holding attachment. The deeper the connection was, the more difficult it becomes to erase its psychological influence. Meaningful emotional energy survives because the human soul does not connect superficially to every person. Some individuals become part of personal transformation itself. Their presence changes emotional awareness, identity, vulnerability, and self-understanding in ways that continue shaping the psyche long after physical separation occurs. Real transformation does not begin the moment a person suffers. It begins the moment they finally understand why they are suffering. Many people experience pain without becoming wiser because they never truly confront the deeper truth behind their actions, choices, or emotional patterns. But when someone genuinely realizes the damage they caused, something powerful begins shifting inside them. Awareness changes the structure of the personality because it forces the individual to see themselves without illusion. The image they once protected through pride, denial, or emotional avoidance starts collapsing, and this creates the beginning of inner transformation. Most human beings spend a large part of life protecting the ego. The ego wants comfort, control, and certainty. It wants to believe I was right or I had no choice. This psychological defense helps people avoid shame temporarily, but it also prevents growth. As long as a person refuses to face emotional truth, they remain trapped inside the same unconscious patterns. They continue hurting others in similar ways because they never recognize the deeper conflict within themselves. Transformation becomes impossible without awareness because unconscious behavior repeats itself automatically. The moment realization appears, however, the inner world begins changing. A person suddenly sees the emotional consequences of their actions clearly. They recognize the pain they caused, the connection they damaged, or the value they failed to appreciate. This awareness often arrives quietly. Sometimes it happens during loneliness, silence, or emotional loss. Sometimes it appears after repeated failures in relationships. The unconscious mind slowly gathers emotional truth until denial can no longer survive. This realization creates psychological discomfort because the individual now faces two versions of themselves at once. One version is the identity they believed in. The other is the truth revealed through their actions. The mind struggles to reconcile these opposites. A person who saw themselves as emotionally strong may suddenly recognize emotional immaturity. Someone who believed they were independent may discover they were avoiding vulnerability out of fear. This confronts, and with the shadow self becomes painful because it destroys comforting illusions. Yet this pain is necessary for transformation. Without discomfort, people rarely change deeply. Emotional suffering forces self-reflection. It pushes hidden fears, insecurities, and unconscious behaviors into awareness. A person begins questioning why they acted the way they did. They start recognizing patterns they once ignored: fear of intimacy, fear of abandonment, pride, emotional avoidance, or the inability to express genuine emotion. What was once unconscious slowly becomes conscious. As awareness grows, behavior naturally changes. The person becomes more reflective and emotionally careful. They begin understanding the emotional weight of their actions instead of acting impulsively. Sometimes they develop empathy because they now understand pain from the inside. Their priorities shift. External validation becomes less important than emotional honesty. They may begin valuing authenticity, connection, and emotional depth more than ego or control because the realization changed their inner perception of life itself. Transformation also changes relationships. A person who becomes self-aware often starts communicating differently, listening differently, and reacting differently. The emotional walls they once depended on begin weakening because they understand the loneliness those defenses created. They no longer see vulnerability as weakness in the same way. True realization permanently alters the psyche because once emotional truth becomes conscious, the individual can no longer fully return to ignorance. The awareness continues shaping their identity, decisions, emotional responses, and understanding of human connection from deep within the soul itself. In the end, the human soul cannot escape emotional truth forever. A person may hide behind silence, pride, distance, or denial, but the unconscious mind continues carrying what truly mattered. When someone realizes they made a mistake, the change does not begin outside, it begins deep within the psyche. Loss creates awareness, regret creates inner conflict, and emotional truth slowly transforms the personality from within. Some connections are not ordinary, they leave permanent marks on the mind, heart, and soul. And once a person truly understands the value of what they lost, they are never completely the same again. His is the power of realization. This is the power of emotional awakening. And this is why awareness has the ability to change everything. Thank you all for listening with an open mind and heart. I truly hope these words gave you a deeper understanding of human emotions, relationships, and the hidden movements of the unconscious mind. May you continue growing in wisdom, self-awareness, and emotional strength. Good luck on your journey through life, and may you always recognize the value of genuine connections before silence and loss are forced to teach it for you.